In the spring of 1852, a traveling photographer arrived at a rural Baptist church somewhere in the Carolina lowlands to document what appeared to be an ordinary baptism ceremony. 15 enslaved children stood in neat rows before the church's weathered wooden steps, their Sunday clothes carefully pressed, their expressions solemn. The photograph survived more than a century and a half, stored in a church archive box labeled simply, Baptism Records, 1852. But in 2019, when a doctoral student in Southern history examined the daguerreotype under modern enhancement technology, she noticed something the original viewers had missed. Behind their backs, hidden from the photographer's direct line of sight, each child held something in their clenched fists. What followed was an investigation that would unravel one of the most haunting secrets of the antebellum South. The children weren't just posing for a baptism photo. They were documenting evidence. They were creating a record that would outlast their lifetimes, their owners, and the institution that had enslaved them. What they held behind their backs would reveal a conspiracy of silence that had persisted for 167 years, protected by burned records, falsified death certificates, and a community's collective amnesia. This is the story of what those children were hiding, why they chose that moment to preserve their secret, and how their silent rebellion finally found its voice in the 21st century. Chapter 1. The Photograph That Wouldn't Fade. In March 2019, Dr. Sarah Kemp sat in the climate-controlled archive room of the Old Providence Baptist Church in rural South Carolina, her gloved hands carefully turning pages of brittle baptism records. She had come to research religious practices among enslaved populations for her dissertation at Duke University. What she found instead would consume the next 6 years of her life. The daguerreotype had been stored between 2 pages of a church ledger, wrapped in brown paper that had protected it from light and moisture. The image showed 15 children arranged in 3 rows, their ages appearing to range from perhaps 6 to 14 years old. The church itself stood behind them, its white clapboard exterior bright against a dark sky that suggested an approaching storm. At first glance, the photograph seemed unremarkable, except for its excellent preservation and the unusual formality of having enslaved children photographed at all. Dr. Kemp initially noticed the children's posture. In most antebellum photographs of enslaved people, subjects either looked away from the camera or held rigidly neutral expressions, their bodies positioned by photographers who rarely considered them as individuals. But these 15 children stared directly at the lens with an intensity that transcended the technical limitations of 1850s photography. Their eyes held something Dr. Kemp had spent years learning to recognize in historical images: intentionality. She photographed the daguerreotype with her high-resolution camera and returned to her hotel room that evening to examine the image on her laptop. Using basic photo enhancement software, she adjusted the contrast and brightness. That's when she saw it. The children's arms hung at their sides, but their fists were closed, every single one of them. In an era when photographers demanded complete stillness to prevent blurring, the natural position would have been open hands or hands clasped in front. Instead, these children had deliberately positioned their hands behind their backs, their fingers wrapped tightly around something. Dr. Kemp spent the next week in the church archives, searching for any documentation related to the baptism. The church record showed that on April 12, 1852, 15 enslaved children from the Whitmore plantation had been baptized in a special ceremony. The plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Whitmore, had apparently funded the ceremony as part of his public demonstration of Christian paternalism. Local newspapers from that month praised Colonel Whitmore for his religious devotion and care for the spiritual welfare of his enslaved workforce. But there was nothing about the photograph itself. No photographer's name, no mention of who had commissioned it, no record of where the original glass plate might have been stored. It was as if the image had appeared in the church archive spontaneously, without context or explanation. Dr. Kemp contacted 3 specialists in 19th century photography. Using advanced imaging technology, they examined the daguerreotype under different light spectrums. What they discovered sent tremors through the academic community. Behind their backs, the children weren't just hiding their hands. They were holding objects, small flat objects that created distinct shadow patterns. The specialist estimated the objects to be roughly the size of playing cards, perhaps slightly larger, and when they enhanced the image further, they could see faint markings on some of the children's knuckles, scratches, possibly self-inflicted, possibly made by the edges of whatever they were gripping so tightly. The question became obvious. What were 15 enslaved children hiding from their owners, their enslavers, and the photographer, while simultaneously preserving that secret in an image that would survive for more than a century and a half? Before moving forward, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Dr. Kemp knew she had stumbled onto something significant, but she had no idea that the objects in those children's hands would reveal a story of systematic violence, institutional cover-up, and a community's conspiracy of silence that had protected a monster for generations. The Whitmore plantation, she would learn, harbored secrets far darker than anyone had imagined, and those 15 children had risked everything to make sure the truth would someday be known. Chapter 2. The Whitmore Estate and its Silent Witnesses. The Whitmore plantation occupied nearly 3,000 acres of Carolina lowlands, with rice fields stretching toward the coastline and timber forests marking its inland boundaries. Colonel Marcus Whitmore had inherited the estate from his father in 1840 and had expanded operations significantly over the following decade. By 1852, historical records showed he held property rights over approximately 240 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthiest men in the region. Contemporary newspaper accounts painted Colonel Whitmore as a model plantation owner. He was a deacon at Old Providence Baptist Church, a contributor to missionary funds, and an outspoken advocate for what he called Christian stewardship of enslaved populations. In letters preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, he wrote eloquently about the moral responsibilities of plantation owners and criticized the excesses of less enlightened slaveholders. He believed or claimed to believe that slavery was a benevolent institution that provided Christianization and civilization to people he considered incapable of self-governance. Dr. Kemp traced the Whitmore family through census records, property deeds, and personal correspondence. Marcus Whitmore had married Elizabeth Harriet Caldwell in 1838, daughter of another prominent planting family. They had 3 children who survived to adulthood: Marcus Jr., born in 1839, Elizabeth Ann, born in 1841, and Samuel Caldwell, born in 1844. Family portraits showed a prosperous household, the parents stern and dignified, the children dressed in expensive clothes with formal expressions that betrayed no hint of the darkness growing beneath their estate's manicured surface. But there were inconsistencies in the historical record that Dr. Kemp couldn't ignore. The most troubling appeared in the slave schedules attached to census records. Between 1840 and 1850, the Whitmore plantation showed a dramatic increase in the number of enslaved children under the age of 10. Most plantations saw steady but modest natural increase among their enslaved populations. The Whitmore numbers suggested something different. In 1840, there were 12 children under 10. By 1850, there were 63. Dr. Kemp found partial explanations in estate records. Colonel Whitmore had purchased several enslaved families from plantations facing financial difficulties in the 1840s. He had also inherited 28 enslaved people when his uncle died in 1846. But even accounting for these acquisitions, the numbers didn't fully align. There were too many young children, and too many of them appeared in records without clear parentage documentation. The researcher began examining death records from the surrounding county. What she found there deepened the mystery. Between 1845 and 1860, the Whitmore plantation reported an unusually high number of deaths among enslaved women of childbearing age. The recorded causes varied: fever, consumption, accident, complications following childbirth, but the pattern was statistically anomalous. In one 18-month period alone, 7 women between the ages of 16 and 32 had died on the plantation, all listed with vague medical descriptions that suggested inadequate or non-existent medical examination. Even more disturbing were the gaps in baptism records. Dr. Kemp had expected to find documentation for the children who appeared in census data, but many were missing from church records entirely. The 15 children in the 1852 photograph represented the largest single-group baptism the church had ever conducted for enslaved children from one plantation. Before that ceremony, there had been only sporadic individual baptisms, and after it, the practice seemed to stop almost completely. Local historians Dr. Kemp consulted offered various explanations. Perhaps Colonel Whitmore had changed his religious practices. Perhaps the church leadership had disagreed with him on theological matters. Perhaps it was simply administrative oversight in an era of poor record-keeping. But Dr. Kemp suspected something more sinister. The 15 children in that photograph had been selected for baptism at a specific moment, documented by a traveling photographer whose name had been deliberately erased from all records, and then the practice had ended abruptly. She began searching for descendants of people who had been enslaved on the Whitmore plantation. Through genealogical databases, African American historical societies, and DNA ancestry services, she identified 11 families with documented connections to the estate. She reached out to each of them, explaining her research and asking if they had any family stories or documents related to their ancestors' time on the plantation. Most responded with variations of the same message. Their ancestors had never spoken about that time. Whatever had happened on the Whitmore plantation had been buried in silence so deep that 4 generations later, their descendants knew only fragments. One woman in her 70s told Dr. Kemp that her great-great-grandmother, who had lived until 1937, would become physically ill if anyone mentioned the Whitmore name. Another family preserved a small leather-bound Bible that contained handwritten names and dates, but entire pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges. The silence itself became evidence. Something had happened on that plantation, something so terrible that survivors had chosen to protect their descendants by refusing to speak of it. And somehow, those 15 children in the 1852 photograph had tried to preserve evidence of that horror in the only way available to them. Chapter 3. The House Servant Who Kept Secrets. Breaking through the wall of silence required patience, persistence, and eventually, extraordinary luck. In June 2020, Dr. Kemp received an email from a woman named Patricia Henderson, a retired schoolteacher in Charleston. Patricia had seen Dr. Kemp's research query posted in an African American genealogy forum. She wrote that her great-great-great-grandmother, a woman named Dinah, had worked as a house servant at the Whitmore plantation from approximately 1845 until emancipation. Patricia's grandmother had told her stories about Dinah when Patricia was a child, stories she had mostly forgotten until seeing Dr. Kemp's request. Dr. Kemp drove to Charleston the following week. Patricia Henderson lived in a modest house in a historically black neighborhood, its walls covered with family photographs spanning 5 generations. She served sweet tea and homemade pound cake, then disappeared into a back bedroom. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside the box was a collection of items that Patricia's grandmother had saved: letters, newspaper clippings, a cameo brooch, a set of ivory buttons, and buried at the bottom, a journal bound in cracked leather. The journal's pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It had belonged to Dinah. Enslaved people keeping journals was rare but not unheard of. Some had learned to read and write secretly, despite laws prohibiting literacy among enslaved populations. Others had convinced sympathetic white people to teach them. Dinah's journal suggested she had learned from one of Colonel Whitmore's daughters, Elizabeth Ann, who had apparently taken it upon herself to educate selected house servants against her father's explicit orders. The journal entries were sporadic and often cryptic, written in a mixture of standard English and phonetic spellings. Many passages discussed daily household tasks, weather observations, and brief mentions of family members. But scattered throughout were entries that hinted at darker realities. In one passage from 1847, Dinah wrote, "Miss Elizabeth cry all morning. Say she heard the screams again from the quarters. Colonel whip Samuel for asking about his sister who disappeared Tuesday last. Nobody speak her name now. It like she never been born." Another entry from 1849 was more explicit. "3 more girls brought to the big house last night. Colonel say they being trained for housework, but they taken to the separate cabin behind the garden. Nobody go near that place. The white doctor come twice this month. Miss Elizabeth try to help, but Colonel lock her in her room when doctor visit. Dr. Kemp photographed every page of the journal, her hands trembling as the pattern emerged. The separate cabin appeared repeatedly in Dinah's entries, always described with euphemisms and careful language, but the implications were clear. Young enslaved women and girls were being taken to this cabin, held there for periods of weeks or months, and then either returned to field work or disappeared from plantation records entirely. The most devastating entry came from early 1852, just weeks before the baptism photograph was taken. Dinah wrote, "The 15 little ones who've been born in the secret cabin getting baptized next month. Colonel say it is Christian duty. But we all know why he do it now. They getting old enough to talk and ask questions. He want them marked as his property in God eyes before they understand what been done to their mothers. Some of them mothers ain't with us no more. Some took their own lives rather than live with what happened. God forgive me for writing this, but somebody got to know. Somebody got to remember when we all gone. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach." Patricia Henderson sat quietly while Dr. Kemp read through her ancestors' journal. When the researcher looked up, tears streaming down her face, Patricia nodded slowly. "My grandmother told me stories," she said. "Stories about the place they called Hell House. That's what the enslaved people named that cabin. She said the screams could be heard across the plantation on certain nights. She said Colonel Whitmore was running a breeding program, but it wasn't like the kind you read about in history books. It was something worse, something that broke the women who survived it and killed the ones who couldn't." The journal provided context, but Dr. Kemp still didn't understand what the children had been hiding behind their backs in the photograph. The answer to that question would require examining the physical evidence that had been preserved against all odds, hidden in a place no one had thought to look for more than a century and a half. Chapter 4. The Archaeological Discovery. In September 2021, armed with Dinah's journal entries and growing evidence of systematic crimes at the Whitmore plantation, Dr. Kemp partnered with Dr. Marcus Freeman, a forensic archaeologist from the University of South Carolina. Together, they submitted a proposal to the current owners of the property that had once been the Whitmore estate. Most of the original acreage had been subdivided and developed over the decades, but the core area around the former big house and slave quarters remained largely undisturbed, now part of a nature preserve managed by a historical conservation trust. The trust initially resisted, citing concerns about disturbing a sensitive historical site. But Dr. Kemp's documentation of systematic violence and potential criminal activity eventually convinced them to allow a limited archaeological survey. In October 2021, a team of 6 archaeologists, 3 graduate students, and 2 ground-penetrating radar specialists began mapping the area where Dinah's journal indicated the separate cabin had once stood. The radar images showed anomalies immediately. Behind what appeared to be the foundation of a small structure, approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, the ground displayed irregular patterns consistent with deliberate burial. Dr. Freeman's team began careful excavation, removing soil in layers and screening every shovelful for artifacts. What they found in the first week stunned everyone. Buried approximately 3 feet below the surface, wrapped in what remained of oilcloth, were 15 small wooden tablets. Each tablet measured roughly 4 inches by 6 inches and was about half an inch thick. Despite being buried for more than 170 years, the tablets had been sealed well enough to preserve what was carved into their surfaces. Names, dates, and brief messages, all painstakingly etched into the wood with what appeared to be a nail or similar sharp implement. The tablets matched the size and shape of the objects the children had been hiding in the 1852 photograph. Dr. Kemp and her team carefully documented each one, photographing them from multiple angles before allowing conservation specialists to begin preservation treatments. What emerged was a record of horrors that had been deliberately buried by someone who understood they couldn't expose the truth while Colonel Whitmore lived, but wanted to ensure it would someday be discovered. Each tablet bore a child's name and birth date, along with the name of their mother. But what made the discovery historically significant was the additional information carved below. "Born in Hell House" appeared on 12 of the 15 tablets. 3 others said mother died giving birth or mother disappeared 1850. One tablet included a message that read, "My mama named Sarah. She died screaming. Colonel killed her when I was born. This is true. God witness it." Dr. Freeman's team expanded the excavation area. 20 feet from the tablets, they uncovered a burial site containing the remains of at least 8 individuals, all adult women based on preliminary skeletal analysis. The bones showed signs of trauma, healed fractures that had never been properly set, evidence of malnutrition, and in 2 cases damage consistent with complications from childbirth without medical intervention. One skeleton's pelvic structure suggested she had died during labor, her remains buried hastily in a shallow grave. Carbon dating and historical analysis confirmed that the burials dated to the period between 1845 and 1855, exactly when Dinah's journal described the separate cabin operation. These were the women who had been brought to Hell House, forced into a breeding program designed by Colonel Whitmore, and either worked to death, killed during childbirth, or driven to take their own lives rather than continue suffering. But the most significant discovery came from analyzing the tablets themselves. The wood was identified as heart pine, a dense hardwood common in construction during the antebellum period. Chemical analysis of the carved inscriptions revealed traces of lamp-black ink mixed with what appeared to be blood. Someone had helped the children create these tablets, teaching them what to write and how to preserve them. The handwriting varied between tablets, suggesting different levels of literacy, but the format was consistent. These weren't random scratchings. They were deliberate testimony, created with the intention of surviving as evidence. Dr. Kemp returned to the 1852 photograph with new understanding. The children hadn't just been hiding the tablets during the baptism. They had been holding them while being photographed, creating a secondary record that connected their faces to their testimony. If the tablets were ever found, the photograph would prove who had created them. If the photograph survived, it would suggest where to look for buried evidence. Together, they formed a backup system of truth-telling that had outlasted slavery itself. The team found one more piece of the puzzle buried near the tablets, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be pages torn from a ledger book. The pages were too damaged to read completely, but fragments revealed columns of numbers, dates, and partial names. These were financial records, showing payments made to a physician named Dr. Horace Pemberton for services rendered at the Whitmore plantation between 1846 and 1854. The amounts were substantial, far more than typical medical consultations would cost. Dr. Pemberton, it seemed, had been compensated for his participation in Colonel Whitmore's breeding program and for his silence about what happened to the women who died under his inadequate care. Chapter 5. The Conspiracy of Silence. Reconstructing what happened at the Whitmore plantation between 1845 and 1860 required piecing together fragments from multiple sources. Dinah's journal, the carved tablets, archaeological evidence, and newly discovered documents that had been deliberately scattered across different archives to prevent anyone from assembling the complete picture. Dr. Kemp spent 2 years tracking down references, cross-checking genealogies, and fighting legal battles for access to sealed estate records. What emerged was a story of systematic exploitation, protected by layers of institutional complicity. Colonel Marcus Whitmore had not been the benevolent Christian patriarch he portrayed himself to be. Instead, he had been running what amounted to a forced breeding operation, focused not on increasing his enslaved workforce generally, but on producing children who met specific criteria that served his financial and personal interests. Through estate papers eventually unsealed by court order in 2023, Dr. Kemp discovered that Whitmore had entered into informal agreements with several other plantation owners and with wealthy men from Charleston and Savannah who had no agricultural interests at all. These men paid substantial sums to the Whitmore estate in exchange for certain specified services that were never named explicitly in the documents, but were clear from the patterns of payments and the ages of the children subsequently listed in Whitmore's property schedules. The operation worked like this. Young enslaved women, typically between the ages of 14 and 25, would be selected from Whitmore's workforce or purchased from other plantations if they met specific physical criteria. They would be taken to the separate cabin that the enslaved community called Hell House, where they would be held in isolation. Dr. Horace Pemberton, a physician who had been struck off the medical rolls in Virginia for unspecified ethical violations before moving to South Carolina, would examine them and administer various treatments designed to ensure they could bear children. The women would then be forced into a breeding program. The tablets in Dinah's journal made clear that Colonel Whitmore himself was directly involved in these assaults, as were selected overseers and occasionally the men who had paid for access. When women became pregnant, they were held in the cabin throughout their pregnancy. If they gave birth successfully, the children would be taken from them within days and handed over to enslaved women who worked as wet nurses. The mothers would either be returned to field work or, if they had been damaged physically or psychologically by the experience, would disappear from plantation records entirely. Dinah's journal included a heartbreaking passage from 1851. Saw Mary today working in the rice fields. She'd been in Hell House 6 months ago. Had a baby girl they took from her. She don't speak no more. Just work and stare at nothing. Her sisters say Mary tried to run away twice, but they caught her and brought her back. Now she's just waiting to die. Some of the women drink poison they make from plants. Some walk into the swamp and don't come back. Some just stop eating till they fade away. Colonel call it laziness and melancholy. But we know what it really is. It despair so deep death seemed like mercy. The children born from this program faced different fates. Some were kept on the Whitmore plantation and raised by the general enslaved population, though they were often subjected to special scrutiny and given particular work assignments. Others were sold to the men who had paid Whitmore, transferred as property to plantations or households in other states where records would be harder to trace. A few were sent to specialized facilities in New Orleans and Charleston that trained enslaved children for domestic service in wealthy households, commanding premium prices because of their lighter skin tones and European features. The 15 children in the photograph represented those who had reached an age where they could begin to understand and articulate what had been done to their mothers and potentially to them. The baptism ceremony wasn't an act of Christian charity. It was a public display meant to establish Whitmore's continued control over them and to create official documentation of his ownership rights before witnesses who were too invested in the existing social order to question the arrangement. But someone had decided to resist. The tablets revealed that an enslaved woman named Ruth, who worked as a house servant and had learned to read and write, had helped the children create their testimony. She had obtained wood from a demolished outbuilding, shown them how to carve letters with a stolen nail file, and helped them understand that their words might someday be found and believed. Ruth's name appeared in Whitmore's records until 1854, when she was listed as died of natural causes. She was 29 years old. The conspiracy of silence that protected these crimes extended far beyond the plantation itself. Church records showed that 3 different Baptist ministers served at Old Providence between 1845 and 1860, and all of them would have been aware of unusual circumstances surrounding the large number of children being baptized from the Whitmore estate. Yet none raised questions in official church documents. Local physicians, including several who treated the Whitmore family for ordinary ailments, must have known about Dr. Pemberton's activities, but never reported ethical violations to any medical society. Most damningly, county officials who conducted periodic slave schedule censuses would have noticed the demographic anomalies, the high death rate among women of childbearing age, the unusual number of young children without documented parentage, the frequent transfers of children off the plantation at younger ages than was typical. Yet the records contained no notes of investigation, no official inquiries, no referrals to magistrates or courts. The entire local power structure had chosen to look away from crimes happening in plain sight, because exposing them would have undermined the economic and social foundations of the slaveholding society. After the Civil War, the silence deepened rather than broke. Emancipation meant that formerly enslaved people could theoretically have testified about their experiences, but the political and social chaos of Reconstruction made such testimony dangerous and unlikely to result in justice. Colonel Marcus Whitmore died in 1871, having never faced legal consequences for his actions. His son Marcus Jr. took control of what remained of the family estate and successfully rebuilt its reputation, through strategic investments in railroads and textile manufacturing. The family became respected members of New South business elite, their past carefully sanitized. Chapter 6. Voices finally heard. The public revelation of the Whitmore plantation horrors in 2024 sparked intense debate about historical accountability, memorialization, and the ongoing legacy of slavery. Dr. Kemp's research, supported by the archaeological evidence and documentary record, was published in a groundbreaking book titled Tablets of Testimony: Enslaved Children and the Hidden History of Breeding Violence in the Antebellum South. The descendants of people enslaved at the Whitmore plantation held a memorial service at the site where Hell House once stood. Patricia Henderson, whose great-great-great-grandmother Dinah had documented the crimes, spoke about the importance of breaking generational silence. "Our ancestors didn't speak because speaking would have destroyed us," she said. "But they preserved the truth anyway, knowing that someday we would be strong enough to face it." Those 15 children who held those tablets behind their backs in that photograph were braver than we can imagine. They found a way to testify when testimony meant death. The current descendant of the Whitmore family, a businessman named Robert Whitmore who lives in Atlanta, released a statement acknowledging his ancestors' crimes and pledging support for a memorial and education center to be built on the site. "No apology can undo the suffering inflicted by Marcus Whitmore and those who enabled him," the statement read. "But we can choose to honor the survivors and victims by ensuring their stories are told truthfully and their names are remembered." The 15 children from the photograph were identified through genealogical research and DNA analysis. Their names were Thomas, age 14, Sarah, age 13, Benjamin, age 12, Rebecca, age 12, Jacob, age 11, Mary, age 11, Isaiah, age 10, Rachel, age 9, Samuel, age 9, Hannah, age 8, Moses, age 8, Dinah, age 7, Elizabeth, age 7, Grace, age 6, and Peter, age 6. Each had descendants living today, scattered across the United States. Many had never known about their connection to the Whitmore plantation until Dr. Kemp's research brought them together. The archaeological site became the location for a permanent memorial designed by Maya Lin, the architect who created the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The memorial features a circular arrangement of 15 granite pillars, each inscribed with the name of one of the children from the photograph and the text from their buried tablet. At the center stands a larger pillar listing the names of the 8 women whose remains were found in the burial site, along with space for the names of other victims who have not yet been identified. The inscription reads, "They testified in silence, we hear them now." If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of these 15 children and their mothers reach more people. In 2025, the Old Providence Baptist Church issued a formal apology for its historical complicity in the crimes at the Whitmore plantation. The church established a Historical Truth Commission to examine its records from the slavery era and identify other instances where church leadership had failed to challenge or had actively participated in the dehumanization of enslaved people. The original 1852 photograph was returned to the church and displayed in a new historical exhibit that includes copies of the tablets, excerpts from Dinah's journal, and educational materials about the breeding violence that affected thousands of enslaved women across the South. Dr. Kemp's research sparked renewed investigation into similar cases at other plantations. Historians began examining demographic patterns, burial sites, and fragmentary documentary evidence for signs of systematic breeding programs that went beyond the general increase in enslaved populations that all plantations pursued. Early findings suggested that the Whitmore case, while particularly well documented, was not unique. Breeding violence had been more widespread than previously acknowledged in historical scholarship, hidden behind euphemisms and protected by the same conspiracies of silence that had shielded Colonel Whitmore. The story of the 15 children and their tablets also inspired a new generation of researchers to take seriously the testimony of enslaved people, even when that testimony came in unconventional forms. Archaeological investigation of former plantation sites increased dramatically. Archives began systematic searches for forgotten journals, letters, and documents that might contain evidence of crimes that official records had obscured. DNA genealogy companies developed specialized projects to help descendants of enslaved people trace their family histories and potentially discover connections to documented cases of breeding violence and other systematic abuses. For the descendants who gathered at the memorial dedication in late 2024, the revelation of the truth brought both pain and healing. Patricia Henderson said it best. "My great-great-great-grandmother Dinah wrote in her journal that somebody had to know, somebody had to remember when they were all gone. Well, we know now. We remember now. And we're making sure their courage and their suffering weren't in vain. Those children who stood on those church steps with their testimony hidden behind their backs, they were creating a future where truth would matter more than silence. We're living in that future now. It took 172 years, but we finally heard their voices." Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore plantation and the 15 children whose silent testimony finally found its voice. See you in the next video. The photograph remains. 15 faces, solemn and determined, stare across the centuries with eyes that knew too much too young. Behind their backs, their small hands clutched tablets of wood bearing witness to crimes that were supposed to be buried forever. They understood something profound, that truth has weight, that testimony endures, and that even in the deepest silence, voices can be preserved for those who will someday be ready to listen. What they hid behind their backs wasn't just evidence. It was hope that justice, however delayed, would someday arrive.